You have significant ties to both Canada and the US, but how do you know which country you belong to for tax purposes when you retire abroad? I'm Joe Macek, cross-border investment advisor and portfolio manager with iAPrivateWealth and iAPrivateWealth USA, and today I'm going to help you determine where you stand when it comes to residency by using the Canada-U.S. residency tiebreaker rules. Let's dive in and figure it out. So you have significant ties to both Canada and the US, and you're unsure which country you belong to for tax purposes. You need to know because your residency status will decide which country, Canada or the US, can tax your worldwide income. It's critical to determine your residency status to help ensure that you file everything correctly. But here's what a lot of people don't know. The IRS and the CRA won't dig into your personal details or make this determination for you. You will need to provide the evidence yourself, which means that you can control the facts and the evidence that you provide. And today we're going to walk through what's called the Canada-U.S. tax treaties tiebreaker test to help you figure out where you should be filing as your home country. So why is this important? Well, knowing which country you are a resident of affects how your worldwide income is taxed, and it generally prevents issues like double taxation. For example, if you're a U.S. resident, your global income, including Canadian earnings, is taxed by the IRS. If you're a Canadian resident, the CRA taxes your worldwide income. Knowing your residency helps you file correctly, and you can take advantage of tax treaties and any foreign income tax credits, which can potentially reduce or even eliminate additional taxes on income earned in the other country. Now let's dive into how tax residency is determined in the US and Canada under the Canada-US tax treaty tiebreaker test. It's important to understand that your tax residency isn't determined by your immigration status. Many people mistakenly believe that having a certain immigration status in the US or Canada automatically makes them a resident or non-resident, when in reality, the tax residency decision is based on completely different criteria. You can be illegally present in either country and still be considered a tax resident. Tax residency is determined by factors like where you have significant ties, such as where you live and work, not by your immigration status. This means that even if you're in Canada or the US illegally, you could still be subject to its tax laws if you meet certain residency requirements. Also, US states are not signatories to the Canada-US tax treaty, which means while the federal governments of the US and Canada have a tax treaty that outlines how to handle taxes on income earned across borders, this treaty isn't recognized by every state. So even if the tax treaty federally prevents double taxation on income between Canada and the US, you might still face state taxes in places like California or New York, which do not recognize the tax treaty federally. This means that in theory, you could be considered a federal resident of Canada, but also considered a resident of the US in a state like California or Hawaii or others. In short, this situation could result in you being subject to Canadian federal income tax, US state income taxes, and Canadian provincial income taxes as well. So it's critical to determine your state tax residency, especially if you have connections to a state where you own a home, work, or have other activities. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the differences between Canada and the US when filing your taxes as a non-resident. As a Canadian, you can retain your Canadian citizenship without having to file Canadian taxes if you're a non-resident. This means that if you live abroad and are considered a non-resident for tax purposes, you don't need to file Canadian taxes on your worldwide income. This is of course assuming you don't owe any Canadian tax on any RSPs or accounts that you've left in Canada. However, in the US, if you hold a green card or US citizenship, even if you have an expired green card, you are required to file US taxes regardless of where you live every year. And when it comes to determining your residency, there are differences in how Canada and the US approach this. Canada's tax residency rules are unique and more subjective. The CRA has some guidelines, but it doesn't really use a strict formula. They consider a number of factors like where your spouse lives, where your driver's license is from, and where your children or dependents are. They mix all of these factors together and decide your residency based on where it seems you have the strongest connections. It obviously sounds a bit vague, but Canada basically pieces together a picture of your life to determine if you're a resident. Now, the US approach to tax residency is very different and much more objective. It's based much more on specific tests like whether or not you are a lawful permanent resident, or as it's more commonly known, having a green card. If you hold a green card, even if it's expired as we mentioned earlier, you are considered a lawful permanent resident. This status doesn't end at expiry, but it only ends when it is formally abandoned or rescinded by a judge. Unlike Canada's more subjective method, the US has clear-cut criteria for determining residency. Another key test for US residency is the substantial presence test, also known as the 183-day test. This means that if you spend more than 183 days in the US, there is a solid chance that you would be considered a US resident for tax purposes. Remember, even part of a day counts as a full day in the US. Now, if you're considered a resident in both Canada and the US and you're confused as to where you should file, you'll need to use the Canada-U.S. tax treaty's tiebreaker test to determine your primary tax residency. Where you don't need a tiebreaker test is determining whether you should hit that like button and the subscribe button for the YouTube algorithm, as it really helps out my channel. Over 90% of my watch time is generated by viewers who are not subscribed, so please consider liking and subscribing, as it really helps my videos get out to many more incredible viewers like yourself. Thanks again in advance for your support. So the tiebreaker test in the Canada-U.S. tax treaty has 5 steps applied in a specific order. First, it looks at where you have a permanent home. Second, it considers your center of vital interests, which includes where your personal and economic ties are strongest. Third, it checks where your habitual abode is, where you live most of the time. Fourth, it examines your citizenship, and if residency is still unclear after all of these steps, the 5th and final step is a determination by the competent authority, which involves consultation between the tax officials from both countries. Now, what is really important about this 5-step process is that the 5 tests in the tiebreaker process must be applied in a specific order, and once a determination is made on the first test, the process ends there. This means that even if you meet the criteria of the 4 later tests, it doesn't matter. You won't proceed to the other tests if the first one determines your residency. So let's start with the first test, permanent home. This refers to the place where you have a residence available to you and where you actually live. A permanent home isn't just a mailing address. It could be a trailer, a yacht, or a vacation home. The key is whether you use it regularly and it's available to you whenever you need it. You don't have to own it or be on the lease. What counts is that you have real access and you use it often. A permanent home can be anywhere you regularly use, like a friend's place or a parent's home. The key is that you use it as a real home, not just for occasional visits. If you have a permanent home in both countries, you move on to the next step of the tiebreaker test. But if you have a permanent home in only one country, the test ends there and you are considered a resident of that country. Next, the second test is the center of vital interests. This involves 2 parts, personal and economic. For the personal aspect, it looks at where your spouse and dependents live. This doesn't just mean a legal spouse, but anyone with whom you have a relationship similar to marriage. It's where your close family and those who rely on you for support are located. The second part of the center of vital interests test is the economic test. This is often misunderstood. It's not just about where your assets are located, but where you are actively engaged for work. For example, if you work in San Diego, your economic center of vital interests is in San Diego. Having retirement accounts in the country doesn't necessarily tie you to a specific location. However, if you're retired or independently wealthy and you're not working, this test becomes a little less straightforward. Also, both personal and economic centers of vital interests must fall in the same country to determine residency. If your personal ties are in Canada, but your economic ties are in the US, this does not settle the test. You will need both aspects to be in the same country. If they aren't, we move on to the third test, which is habitual abode. Now, habitual abode isn't defined by the Canada-U.S. tax treaty, but it is often described as the 183-night test. Essentially, it's about where you spend most of your nights. The idea is to identify specify the place that you regularly return to, not just where you occasionally visit. This means that every night spent in places like New York, Dallas, or Seattle counts as a night in the US, while nights in Canadian cities like Toronto or Calgary count as nights in Canada. Although the 183 night test seems straightforward, it's not enough just to have a few more nights in one country compared to the other. For example, if you have 184 days in the US and the rest in Canada, this does not mean that you are a US resident. For a clear determination, you need a significant difference. For example, spending over 200 nights in one country while only spending about 165 nights in the other can help establish a strong habitual abode. And while 200 nights isn't a formal requirement, it's a much clearer benchmark to show a clear difference in habitual abode. The next test is citizenship. If you're a citizen of both Canada and the US, this test won't resolve your residency. Similarly, if you're a citizen of neither country, it won't help. However, if you're only a citizen of one country and the previous tests haven't determined your residency, then your citizenship will decide it. Now, if none of the first 4 tests are conclusive, the 5th and final step is the competent authority test. And this involves the IRS and the CRA negotiating to decide which country will claim you as their tax resident and tax your worldwide income. This can be problematic because it does introduce a lot of uncertainty and could take several years to resolve. Ideally, you really want one of the first 4 tests to clearly determine your residency status. If none of those tests provide a clear answer, you're left with the competent authority test, which is not ideal. During this time, both Canadian and US tax authorities might try to tax you on your worldwide income without considering potential tax credits to offset your liability. This can lead to complicated and potentially costly situations. This creates a lot of uncertainty with no guarantee about the outcome. Navigating your tax residency between Canada and the US is critical and can be a complex ordeal. The Canada-U.S. tax treaty tiebreaker test involves 5 decisive steps, from assessing your permanent home and center of vital interests to checking your habitual abode and citizenship. The final daunting step involves negotiation by tax authorities if earlier tests fail. So to help you avoid a tangled mess of double taxation and uncertainty, try to help ensure that you can clearly meet one of the first 4 tests if you can. Do you want to see if you lose your CPP and OAS if you retire abroad? Or maybe you just want to see my latest upload? Well, I've got everything all queued up and ready for you. Click here for more amazing financial insights. I'll be waiting. We'll see you soon.